Welcome. This is Dr. Michio Kaku, professor of theoretical physics at the City College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and this is Exploration. Every week on Exploration, we explore the fascinating world of science and its impact on society. And today, leading off, we're going to summarize some of the big stories in science, plus answer some of the emails that I get, because there's no way I can answer all these emails, so it's better just to do it on radio. Well, the big news that has been dominating the headlines for quite a while concerns flying saucers. Speaking directly to the press with the permission of the military about their encounters with flying saucers. That's right. In fact, one pilot even said that he was in a near collision with a UFO. And they do all sorts of maneuvers that they've never seen before with a conventional aircraft. We're talking about zigzagging without exhaust. We're talking about withstanding G-forces of perhaps 400 times the force of gravity, which would be enough to crush any living organism, and the ability to rocket from zero practically up to 5 to 7 times the speed of sound. We're talking about hypersonic velocities that leave our jets in the dust. Now, what do we make of this? Well, on Exploration today, we'll talk about some of the pros and cons, misconceptions, and, well, the unknowns concerning UFOs. First of all, it's a very hot topic. Years ago on Exploration, we even had a debate between a former Air Force official and somebody who wrote a best-selling book about the Roswell incident of 1947. And very quickly, the argument escalated, and with the point is that the people who believe in flying saucers said there's a cover-up, that the military is covering up information for whatever purpose. And the Air Force official said something rather interesting. He said, well, yeah, maybe there is a cover-up, but maybe it's done for the right reasons. And then the person who was advocating extraterrestrial civilizations at Roswell said that this is an example of dishonesty, because then how do we know what to believe? The military deliberately feeds news items to the press in order to, well, promote the UFO mythology, because it then takes media attention away from what the Air Force is really doing. In Area 51, it's believed that that's where the stealth bomber was perfected. Now, the stealth bomber is not an invisible bomber. It's a bomber that is designed so that it can deflect and diffuse radar signals that impinge upon it. So it's not invisible, but the shape, the distribution of metal, the distribution of conducting materials is chosen so that when radar hits the stealth bomber, the reflected radar signals are dispersed so that it has the radar signature of a large bird. Well, the stealth bomber was used successfully in the Iraq War, and it's an example of what the military can do if it's allowed to test in secrecy, said the Air Force official. So in other words, it's a matter of national security, that the military had to deflect attention away from what it was doing, so it promoted the UFO mythology, and as a consequence, we were able to perfect stealth technology. Well, now we're talking about a whole new area of technology, hypersonic drive. The Russians just last year announced that they have perfected a hypersonic drone weapon that can pierce a Star Wars shield. Now, what does that do to the debate about UFOs? Well, let's try to take it systematically, because there's so many different ways this debate can go. There are 3 possibilities with regards to UFO sightings. One is a natural phenomenon that can be explained using ordinary physics. That's one large possibility. A new possibility is that they are military craft. For example, hypersonic drone vehicles that the Russians, the Chinese, and the Americans all test. they can zigzag. They can travel at hypersonic velocities, 5 to 20 times the speed of sound. So maybe once again, just like the stealth bomber gave rise to lots of UFO sightings years ago, maybe these hypersonic drone weapons are creating the current wave of UFO sightings. But there's a third possibility. The third possibility is, well, let's put it right out, and that is they are in fact from outer space. They are extraterrestrial, so we'll say a few things about extraterrestrial civilizations and what we know or don't know about them. Okay, well, let's just jump right into those three possibilities. A, it's a natural phenomenon. B, they're military phenomenon used to cover up secret programs. And three, well, maybe they really do come from aliens from outer space. So let's take them one at a time. First of all, I get a lot of these sightings in my email, and I'd say about, well, roughly 95% of the time, they can be rather easily explained. So the first likely possibility that generates lots of UFO sightings are meteors. Meteors that come soaring right across the night sky. And sometimes these meteors even break up, giving the impression that the mothership is ejecting scout ships. Well, meteors do not zigzag. And that's what is causing a lot of consternation among military circles. What object can zigzag at such hypervelocities without crushing the electronics and the people inside? So meteors go in one direction, they burn up very quickly, and they can travel at hypersonic velocities, but they don't zigzag. So that's one thing that has to be taken into consideration. Another possibility as well, weather anomalies. It turns out that the weather anomalies can account for all sorts of different kinds of flying saucer sightings. Basically, you have cloud formations that are circular, rotate very rapidly, giving you the illusion that they are some kind of craft hovering in outer space. Then we have the possibility of, believe it or not, the planet Venus. It turns out that we are fooled by looking at objects that are very far away. How do we judge distance? We judge distance by moving our head. Objects that are close to us move a lot when we move our head, but the mountains far away hardly move at all when we move our head. Now, Venus is so far away and so bright that it gives us the illusion that it's following us. Children, for example, often say, "Mommy, Daddy, the moon is following me." And that's because the whole concept of parallax is distorted by looking at something that is so far away that it has no parallax at all. So it's like it's hovering right over your shoulder. In fact, once former President Jimmy Carter saw a flying saucer. He asked the military to look into it. And the military said that, well, to the best of its estimation, it was the planet Venus. So if you're driving down a country road, all alone at night, and you look over your shoulder and you see this bright object following you, what do? You make a left turn, a right turn, and then you look again, and sure enough, it's still following you. And you have the distinct impression that the flying saucer is tailing you. Well, it's actually the planet Venus. Turns out that quite a few UFO sightings, especially those sightings where an object is basically following you, is nothing but the planet Venus. Another possibility is radar echoes. So people who are in radar installations sometimes see blips on their radar screen, but sometimes these blips are nothing but the reflection of radar off a mountain, and so we have basically a false signal. Another possibility is weather balloons. Now, this has to do with the Roswell incident of 1947. Eyewitness accounts say that something or other crashed in the desert in 1947, and who knows, maybe alien bodies were recovered. We don't have any more details than that. And it turns out that the military The military actually did do top-secret experiments with weather balloon in something called Project Mogul. Now, whether or not the Roswell incident was generated by a weather balloon, we don't know, but we do know that the military was doing Cold War testing of the dispersion of radioactive materials in people's backyard. That's right. Believe it or not, according to newspapers in Albuquerque, it turns out the military was dispersing radioactive dust in people's backyards and via weather balloons and tracking the dispersion of radioactive materials to see how far they went. This was, of course, the Cold War. And because of the hysteria around the Cold War, the military was doing all sorts of shenanigans, trying to figure out how nuclear fallout was spread during and after a nuclear war. That's one reason why the military wanted to cover up the Roswell incident, because apparently that weather balloon, Project Mogul, was one of the weather balloons that was sent up to investigate the dispersion of radioactive materials in literally people's backyard. So it's something to think about when we realize that, yes, there were all sorts of shenanigans done by the military during the Cold War. In fact, there's something called MK Ultra. MK Ultra was a top-secret program initiated by the CIA over several decades, enlisting many professors of science at leading universities to do all sorts of bizarre experiments on mind reading, hypnosis, psychogenic drugs, LSD, all sorts of different kinds of weird things. According to documents that have been declassified, the military also hired psychics to see whether or not they could locate Soviet submarines by putting pins in a map. Well, it turns out the psychics didn't know where the hell the Soviet submarines were, and the military wasted millions of dollars in people's tax money to pursue these bizarre claims. But yeah, that's what the CIA was doing for a good portion of the Cold War. It's called Project MK Ultra, and you can simply Google it, and you'll be shocked at the shenanigans that the CIA was engaged with. There's also another factor that we have to put into the equation dealing with natural phenomenon, and this is something called pareidolia. Pareidolia is a scientific term for seeing things that are not really there. For example, look at the clouds. You can't help it. When you look at the clouds, you can't help it. You see all sorts of things up there. You see Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse. You see dragons. You can't help it. Your brain is a pattern-seeking machine, and when it doesn't find patterns, it makes up patterns. For example, when the Notre Dame Cathedral burned down recently, some people looked at the flames and saw the image of Jesus Christ. That's right, Jesus Christ in the flames of Notre Dame. I've seen the photographs, and well, yeah, it does sort of look like Jesus Christ, or at least the artistic renditions of Jesus Christ. But, hey, let's be serious. This is our brain playing tricks on us because we see things that are not really there. Now, this helped us evolve when we were apes millions of years ago, because 9 times out of 10, there's nothing. We see that rustling in the trees, we hear the noise, and it's nothing. But we think there's a tiger there. Well, 9 times out of 10, there is no tiger. But 1 time out of 10, maybe it saved our butt. So, in other words, it's an early warning system, pareidolia, to see things that are not really there. That's why when people look at the tea leaves, they see the future in tea leaves because the brain can't help it. It sees patterns even when patterns do not exist at all. Also in the countryside, it turns out some UFO sightings are due to swamp gas. That's right. Under certain conditions, swamp gas can rise because it's warmer and luminesce. And small little pockets of clouds can emanate from it, giving the impression that the mother ship is ejecting scout ships. Well, the list goes on and on and on. Different kinds of natural phenomena that can explain, who knows, maybe 95% of UFO sightings. But then the question is, what about the remaining 5%? Well, I've seen some of these files. You've seen some of it on TV, in fact, recently. And some of them really make the hair on your neck stand up. You wonder, what? What could possibly be doing these things? Well, as I said, many of the early UFO sightings were basically the after effects of research on the stealth bomber. Now the military is perfecting yet another weapon, and these are the hypersonic weapons. And some people think, aha, maybe that's the origin of some of these stories. First of all, why bother to devise a hypersonic weapon? The Russians are very clear about this. They want a weapon that can maneuver, zigzag at hypersonic velocities 5 times the speed of sound. Why? To evade a Star Wars shield. You see, Russia is not technologically advanced enough to begin a project of building a Star Wars shield of its own. So if the United States has one, what the Russians are going to do is penetrate and basically nullify a Star Wars shield. This means during re-entry, as the nose cone re-enters the atmosphere, it's equipped with mini rockets that allow it to maneuver at hypersonic velocities. That way, U.S. ground radar is confused and doesn't know where the real missile is because the missile is zigzagging back and forth. Well, last March, Vladimir Putin announced that they have successfully tested a hypersonic drone weapon. Therefore, Vladimir Putin said, aha, it means that the American Star Wars shield will soon be totally ineffective and neutralized. Well, is there a hypersonic gap? Well, yes and no. First of all, the United States also had a hypersonic drive system that it was experimenting with, but it abandoned it about 2 years ago because they're very unstable. Coming in at 5 to 10 to 20 times the speed of sound, if you maneuver left, maneuver right, sometimes it spirals out of control and the missile crashes. That was the experience of the United States. So 2 years ago, the military basically abandoned that military weapon system. But now people are saying, well, if the Russians have one, we got to have one too. Not to mention the fact that the Chinese are now working on a hypersonic drive weapon as well. And so some people think that there could be a new arms race with hypersonic drone weapons driving a new expenditure of funds to militarize outer space. Well, UFO sightings, are they hypersonic drone vehicles? Possibly. The drones that were recently shown on national television, they go at approximately 5 times the speed of sound, which is well within the capability of the hypersonic drone that Vladimir Putin talked about. Second of all, they can zigzag. I mean, after all, that's the whole point. The whole point is to have these missiles zigzag on re-entry, so it evades ground radar of the United States Star Wars program. But it has no exhaust. These UFO sightings are very clear. There's no exhaust. Well, this is where it gets a little shaky. If the Russian system is basically a hypersonic drone vehicle that glides on its own, and then can maneuver using fins, then it will also have no exhaust, or maybe it does have some exhaust in order to help it to maneuver. We're not sure about this, but that's one of the main characteristics of these hypersonic drone vehicles. Now, if you look carefully at the news reports recently as to where the sightings took place, they took place off the coast of the United States. Very strange. You would think that they would have, if there are aliens out there, you think that they would have drone experiments right over our missile bases and right over our scientific establishments. Nope. they took place off the coast. Suspects. That leads some people to suspect that maybe these hypersonic drones are not craft from outer space at all, but simply Russian or Chinese hypersonic devices that are teasing us and trying to probe our defenses rather than going right to the heartland of America where we have tons of radar and it would set off an international incident. Better to do it off the coast of the United States in international waters and then test to see how effective the United States program is to monitor these hypersonic drone weapons. So that's a possibility. We don't know for sure if these are hypersonic drones, but it is a possibility. And the fact that these things, these UFOs, can zigzag, creating G-forces up to 400 to 500 times the force of gravity, that simply means that they are robots. They're not organic. There's no person inside because the person inside would be crushed by the enormous G-forces as it zigzags left and right. Basically, it's a robotic device. So is it a hypersonic drone vehicle being tested by the Russians, Chinese, and even the United States? We don't know. But it does satisfy some of the basic characteristics. A, traveling at hypersonic velocities. B, maneuvering. C, perhaps without much of an exhaust as it glides in the Earth's atmosphere. But is it really a device that is man-made? We don't know for sure. Then there's the third possibility. And the third possibility is it is extraterrestrial. This is something that has to be taken seriously. However, there's something called the giggle factor. Whenever you mention extraterrestrial UFOs to scientists, their eyes kind of roll up to the heavens and they start to giggle, and that's the end of the scientific discussion. However, I think we have to take this seriously. For example, we've now identified 4,000 extrasolar planets orbiting around other stars in our own backyard, the Milky Way galaxy. And these planets were identified by ground-based telescopes and by the Kepler space satellite. Now we have a new satellite out there called TESS. Instead of simply scanning one little piece of the heavens, it has the capability of scanning the entire night sky, all of it, looking for planets that are very close, very similar to the Earth. And so we expect to see a new harvest of tens of thousands of new planets being discovered, and we're looking for the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail of planetary research is to find a planet that is our twin, a doppelganger in outer space. It has to be the right size, the size of the Earth. It has to be able to have oceans of liquid water and perhaps oxygen of some sort to support life. And one day, if we find that doppelganger, that will set off a huge number of exciting reports in the scientific literature, because that is the Holy Grail of planetary research. Now, believe it or not, we physicists have actively speculated about what alien civilizations might look like. Now, we don't know their politics and we don't know their society. However, we do know one thing, and that is energy. Energy is something that could be quantified, and energy is how we scale these intelligent civilizations into three categories: type 1, type 2, type 3. A type 1 civilization consumes planetary energy. All the energy, for example, that comes from the sun. They can alter the weather. They can perhaps build cities on the ocean. Even earthquakes, volcanoes, they can modify them. So in other words, any planetary form of energy they can control. Then there's type 2, which is stellar. They control the energy of an entire star. They've colonized perhaps a few nearby planets, but basically their energy source is limitless because it comes from the sun itself. But hey, inevitably, growing at an exponential rate, they will eventually exhaust the power of a star, and they will become type 3. and that is galactic. They will roam the galactic space lanes, getting energy from galaxies and black holes. That's type 3. Now, if you compare these categories with science fiction, then perhaps a type 1 civilization would be something like what you see in Buck Rogers or Flash Gordon, a planetary civilization harnessing planetary power. Type 2 would be Star Trek. That is like the Federation of Planets. They've colonized a few nearby planets, but not much more. Huge parts of the Milky Way galaxy are still totally unexplored, even in Star Trek. Then there's Type 3. Type 3 would be galactic, like Star Wars. Star Wars talks about a galactic civilization, and that would be Type 3. Then the next question is, well, what are we on this scale? We are Type 0. We get our energy from dead plants, oil and coal. We don't play with the weather. We don't play with the sun. We don't play with black holes. No, we simply mine coal and oil, and that supplies us with the meager energy of a Type 0 civilization. However, if you take out a calculator, you can then calculate that we are about 100 years away from becoming Type 1. For example, the Internet is the beginning of the first Type 1 technology that will become the backbone of a planetary civilization's communication system. So the Internet, why is it so marvelous? Is the first planetary technology to hit us while we're still Type 0. Then the next question is, what are they in outer space? If they're that advanced that they can roam the galaxy and reach us from outer space, they are probably Type 2, more than likely Type 3. Now, how much more advanced are they than us? We can also calculate that as well. Let's say our economy grows at the rate of 3% per year. Well, economic growth corresponds to energy growth, and so the energy also grows at the rate of maybe 3% per year. Well, take out your calculator and calculate how long it will take for us to become planetary, and it's about 100 years, growing at roughly 3% a year. What about Type 2? Well, a few thousand years. What about Type 3? Perhaps a few 100,000 years. Well, I'm afraid that's it. Good day.